So, welcome everybody to the second mini lecture for Module 6, the International Relations of the Middle East. So, this is not a lecture that I had intended to record originally. What I originally wanted us to do in this module was to look at some data on national power and think about how your country's national power is formulated, and then we could add that to our spreadsheet. But I decided against that because over the past weekend, so on February 28th, on Saturday, the US and Israel decided to attack Iran. They ended up killing the supreme leader of Iran. Attacks are ongoing. President Trump, at I think like 2 in the morning on Saturday, came out and had like an 8-minute address where he talked about what the US was doing in Iran. And one of the things he mentioned was to try to overthrow the regime and effect regime change. So, in light of that, I decided to modify this week's module so that you can focus on this particular crisis, since it's clearly affecting all of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, some of them much more directly. Like, obviously, Iran is sustaining the most effect from what is happening, but also countries in the Gulf, as well as other Middle Eastern countries, have been attacked by Iran in retaliation. And so we're going to focus on the conflict this particular week, which means I wanted to give you just a little bit of an overview about regime change. Regime change is something that we study more in the conflict literature. So there is like a subfield of political science that focuses on conflict, whether that's civil war or interstate war. I'm actually teaching peace and conflict in the fall, which is where we're going to try to understand like why wars and civil wars happen. Most of the time, conflicts post World War II are civil wars, but obviously interstate disputes do happen, although I will say this conflict between the US and Israel and Iran would only meet the criteria of a war if you had 1,000 battle deaths, and I don't know that we have reached that particular level as of Monday, March 2nd, when I am actually recording this for you all. So, having said that, I want to give you just a little bit of a background about regime change rather than focusing on national power, because this conflict is sure to affect the national power of countries, and so any measures of it that were taken in 2024 are just not going to be relevant. All right, so what do we know about regime change? Well, we actually know quite a lot. Regime change has been studied by political scientists, and regime change basically means you're not just replacing a leader, right? Remember, a state is what is governed, a regime is how that state is governed, and a government are the people who are in charge. So you're not just replacing the government, like who is in charge, you're replacing the way that the entire country operates. So think about like regime change generally as going from like a democracy to an autocracy, or an autocracy to a democracy, or going from one type of autocracy to another type of autocracy. That's what we mean when we say regime change, right? You're like changing the way that like the relationship between the state and its people is structured. It used to be the case that countries were going from autocracy to democracy. This was the most common type of transition. That's actually reversed now. Most countries are like, there's more countries that are becoming more autocratic than there are democratic, which is troubling because democracy is like really good for a whole bunch of outcomes. And this is actually also one of the most common types of regime change, going from, say, like a military autocracy to a civilian one. And there's two main types of regime change, right? You can have regime change from within, so you can have people within the country deciding that they want to change the regime, whether that's through like a revolution, which are pretty rare. Those do not happen very often, although obviously they happened in 1979 in Iran. Revolutions require like the entire population if they're going to be peaceful. Revolutions require the military deciding that they're going to side with the revolutionaries. But you can also have a coup where it's just like, one segment of the military decides that they don't like the way that the country is being run, and so they overthrow it, right? Or you have like a different set of leaders who don't like the way that the country is going and they decide to overthrow it. Or you could have like a popular uprising that's not quite at the level of, say, like a revolution where you're trying to change the entire structure of the country, but you have like a big mass democratic movement, and you might have like a negotiated pact where you have like moderates in the opposition negotiating with moderates in the government, and they decide that it's in everybody's best interest to transition to democracy. And that happens like internally within countries. You also have regime change that happens externally of countries. So where you have like a military intervention where it's like an overt action where the military of another country is coming in expressly to say like, hey, we're going to overthrow your current regime and we're going to institute something else. Or you might have something done like more covertly. And so in all of these processes, whether it's like internal, whether that's like external, the military does play an important role. And that's because the military are obviously the people that have the weapons. And so if you have the military on your side, that's going to dictate which direction the regime change heads and if there actually is a regime change. So if the military stays loyal to the current regime, right, let's say, for example, right, you have like protests that happened. You have these like big massive protests, think like Iran in December and January, and the military decides that it's going to side with the current regime, that it's going to be on the side of those who are in charge and not on the side of the protesters. They're going to crush the protests, and you're not going to have any change happen, right? This has been the case repeatedly in Iran. There have been big protest movements, like huge, like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. Every single time the regime has managed to crush those protests. So some of the reports coming out of Iran actually recently, with regards to these protests that started in like December of 2025 and in January of 2026, which were related to the economy, some reports say that upwards of like 30,000 people were killed in those protests, right? So there's no change that's going to happen there. When the military defects, when it decides to like side with the protesters, if you do have mass protest movements, right? Or if it decides to side with like a democratic opposition and to like just say, okay, you former regime, we're cutting our ties with you, then you will have regime change. This is what happened in Tunisia and Egypt during the Arab Spring. There are reasons, which I'll show you on the next slide, why the military decides to make this choice. But then sometimes if you have like splits in the military, so if you have like part of the military deciding to stay with the regime, another part that decides to like split and side with the opposition, because the military are the people who know how to wage conflict, you may end up in a civil war, right? It's not like preordained, but the chances of it happening are more likely. And this is what occurred in Syria specifically, which we will learn about at the end of the semester. Right, so the military does play an important role in this regime change process. And from our study of comparative politics, we know that there's many reasons why the military might decide to side with either the current regime or with the protesters. So I've just laid out some of the explanations for you here, but basically if they're not paid well, if they're politically sidelined, if they're more of like a professional military as opposed to a politicized one, if they have their own source of revenue that's not tied to the regime, if they have no history of human rights violations on an egregious level, they'll side with the opposition. And if they're not from the same like ethnic group in a country that maybe ethnicity is politicized, then they'll side with the opposition. So these are kind of 6 different reasons or conditions under which we would expect the military to side with the protesters versus siding with the regime, right? So if we're thinking about Iran, there is a very important actor, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who are major players in the country. So what they decide to do is going to be really pivotal when it comes to is Iran going to have a regime change? And if so, what kind? Because regime changes don't necessarily have to lead to democratization. They can actually just lead to another type of autocracy. All right, so we've kind of talked about like that domestic element and what might happen if there is a democratic opposition in a country, and will we see a regime change or not? There are also several cases historically of foreign imposed regime change where like an external country comes in militarily and says, okay, we're going to change the regime. These very rarely are successful. So there's been a lot of research in political science about this. Foreign imposed regime change makes civil war more likely. It very rarely leads countries to change their regime and become democracies. And it also doesn't very often make relations between countries better. So here's links to some articles if you wanted to check those out. Alexander Downs, who is a professor at George Washington University, has written extensively about this. He actually just came out with a book in 2021 that looked at all cases of foreign imposed regime change over the past 2 centuries. And basically, this often goes wrong. It does not lead to the outcomes that the foreign country wants for like the target that they're trying to impose regime change on. And he had kind of 2 reasons why that might happen. It's destroying a state's military means that you now have a disaffected, huge population of people who know how to stage an uprising. And so, if you don't incorporate them into the new political system in some way, that's going to lead to some pretty bad outcomes. So, think about when the US invaded Iraq in 2003. So, Iraq is Iran's neighbor. Iraq was invaded by the US in 2003 because allegedly they had weapons of mass destruction or were producing them, but that turned out to not be the case. And it was pretty easy to overthrow Saddam Hussein, but then it was not easy to implement regime change, in part because Iraq is a country where Saddam Hussein is from the Sunni Muslim group. They are not the majority of people who live in Iraq. Like the majority of the population is actually Shiite Muslim. And so once regime change happened and you started to have elections, it made sense that the Shiites would come to power in the parliament because they make up the majority of the country. But all of the Sunnis who had been members of the Ba'ath Party, which was the ruling party of Iraq before the US invasion, and were members of the military, were basically let go. They had no jobs, right? And there were rebel groups in the country who were Sunni who did not like the way that the government was treating the Sunni population. And so like there were really big protest movements in Iraq about the Shiite government treatment of the Sunnis. And some of those like nonviolent protesters started to turn towards violence. And so you had all of these Sunnis who had extensive military knowledge from being in the military under Saddam Hussein, joining these Sunni rebel groups. And that led to some pretty horrific outcomes in Iraq. So that is not good, right? Also, aside from like the military disintegration part, what can be problematic is when you have a leader that's imposed by like external powers. That leader has like 2 main principles. It has 2 audiences that like he or she, more often than not he, is trying to appease like the external state that imposed them and their domestic audience. And then they fundamentally have different interests, and so that leads to some pretty poor outcomes too. There are some instances, though, of when foreign imposed regime change does work. So think like Germany and Japan after World War II. But according to political science research, you really need three conditions for success here. You have to have the country that is imposing the regime change really involved in rebuilding the country's democracy. So, having free and fair elections, making sure you have an independent judiciary, building up civil society organizations, ensuring that there's like a free press. So, it's not just like come in, remove the leader, boom, you're done, democracy happens. You really have to like rebuild all of this in the country. You have to have a country where there's favorable preconditions. So, the country has to be relatively rich, like not super rich, obviously, like Germany and Japan were devastated after World War II, but you need to have some level of economic development, social cohesion, prior experience with democracy, and the intervention needs to restore the democratic government that ruled the country before. Most targets of foreign imposed regime change do not meet these conditions, and therefore they're going to be less likely to succeed. And so the question in Iran can be like, what is the military going to do? There's not a very strong democratic opposition movement in Iran because it's been repressed so heavily. So whereas in countries like, for example, South Africa, there was a lot of political organization to try to end apartheid. Any time the Iranian government has felt threatened by political mobilization by like leaders, they've sidelined them. They've like tried to prevent any political mobilization from happening. So the military is going to play a huge role in this because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is a really important actor in Iran. And so their loyalty is the reason why all of these huge protests did not lead to regime change, right? And so, is foreign imposed regime change likely to be successful in Iran? Obviously, we will see. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not like a monolithic actor. They obviously have different like factions within it, maybe some that would be more hardline and want the theocratic regime to continue, those that are more pragmatic. So it remains to be seen what happens, but this is an unfolding situation, and because regime change is one of the stated objectives of the U.S. attack on Iran, I wanted to just provide you with some additional information.